Hello, and welcome to Mythos and Logos. They dominated Europe for 1,000 years. Their warriors terrified Rome itself. Their artisans created masterpieces that still astound us. Their druids commanded knowledge that took 20 years to master. They spread from the Atlantic to the Black Sea, from the Scottish Highlands to the plains of Turkey. At their height, Celtic peoples outnumbered Romans, controlled more territory than any Mediterranean power, and possessed technologies that made them the most formidable force north of the Alps. Yet they left almost nothing written in their own hand. No Celtic Caesar penned his memoirs. No Celtic historian chronicled their rise. Their priests, the Druids, deliberately refused to write down their vast learning, trusting everything to memory and the spoken word. What we know of them comes largely from their enemies, from Greek traders who saw them as curiosities, from Roman generals who fought them and needed to justify their wars. We must reconstruct an entire civilization, from the accounts of those who conquered them, from the silent testimony of objects pulled from the earth, from fragments of language embedded in place names across a continent. How do you hear the voice of a people who chose not to write? How do you see a culture that your only witness is viewed through the lens of fear or contempt? Tonight, we will attempt this reconstruction, this archaeological resurrection. We will walk among them in their hill forts and sacred groves, stand beside them in battle, sit at their feasts, try to understand what it meant to be Celtic in a world before Rome's shadow fell across Europe. The story we will uncover is one of innovation and artistry, of fierce independence and fatal disunity, of a culture that transformed the face of Europe, yet ultimately dissolved into the empires that absorbed it. May I ask for your help? Liking and subscribing takes just a moment, but makes a huge difference for the channel. I'm grateful for your consideration. I'm also always amazed by our international reach, so I'd appreciate hearing where you're joining from and your local time. Feel time's current reversing, pulling you gently into the heart of ancient Europe, to a world of mist-shrouded forests and wind-swept hilltops, where iron is still a new and precious metal, where the sound of bronze trumpets echoes across valleys, where patterns swirl and spiral in ways that seduce the eye, where druids hold the memories of generations in their minds, where warriors seek glory more than gold, and where Rome is still just another city-state on a distant peninsula. The first stirrings, Hallstatt and the salt mines. Our story begins not with a bang, but with a mineral. Salt. White gold, the preservative that made civilization possible, that allowed meat to last through winter, that made long journeys feasible, that was quite literally worth its weight in precious metal. And in the mountains of what we now call Austria, in a valley surrounded by peaks, lay one of the richest salt deposits in all of Europe. The place is called Hallstatt. Even today, it is almost impossibly picturesque. A small village clinging to the edge of a mountain lake, houses reflected in still water. But 3,000 years ago, this valley held something more valuable than scenery. Deep in the mountain above the lake, seams of salt ran through the rock, pure and abundant. And sometime around 1200 BC, people discovered these deposits and began to dig. The miners who worked these tunnels were not primitive. They engineered sophisticated ventilation shafts to keep the air breathable far underground. They carved staircases into the rock, built wooden support structures, created drainage systems to channel away the water that seeped through stone. They developed specialized tools, bronze pickaxes that could chip away at salt rock hour after hour. Some of these ancient tools have been found, preserved by the very salt they were used to extract, still sharp after 3 millennia. The wealth that flowed from these mines transformed the communities that controlled them. Salt was currency. Salt was power. Salt meant you could preserve food for trade, could support larger populations, could accumulate resources. The graves around Hallstatt tell the story of this wealth. Archaeologists have uncovered burial sites from this period that contain riches almost beyond belief. Bronze swords with golden hilts, amber beads from the Baltic Sea hundreds of miles to the north, jewellery crafted with extraordinary skill, wagons, actual four-wheeled wagons, buried alongside the dead to carry them to the afterlife. These were not the burials of simple miners. These were the graves of chieftains, of an aristocracy built on salt. The Hallstatt culture, as scholars now call it, was sophisticated in ways that challenge our assumptions about Bronze Age Europe. They traded across vast distances. Baltic, amber, Mediterranean ivory, tin from Cornwall. Their metalworkers created objects of stunning beauty. Their social hierarchy was complex and stratified. They were building the foundation of what would become Celtic Europe. But Hallstatt was just the beginning. What started in these Austrian valleys would spread across a continent, carried by people, by ideas, by technologies that would revolutionize warfare and transform societies. The Celts were beginning to stir, though they did not yet know themselves by that name. They were beginning the long journey from obscurity to dominance, from the margins to the centre of European history. From the earth, ironworking and innovation. Around 800 BC, something changed. A new technology began to spread through the communities of Central Europe, a technology that would alter the balance of power across the entire continent. Human beings learned to work iron. This was not like the discovery of bronze. Bronze, that ancient alloy of copper and tin, had been known for centuries. It was reliable, relatively easy to work, produced beautiful objects and serviceable weapons. But bronze had limitations. The metals needed to make it were not found everywhere. Tin especially was rare, found in only a few locations. This meant bronze was expensive, controlled by elites, never abundant enough to equip entire populations. Iron was different. Iron ore lay everywhere, in bogs and riverbeds, in rocky outcrops across Europe. The challenge was not finding it but learning to work it. Iron requires much higher temperatures than bronze, temperatures that early furnaces struggled to reach. The metal is harder to cast, more temperamental, prone to brittleness, if not properly treated. For centuries, iron was inferior to bronze, a curiosity rather than a revolution. But sometime around the beginning of the first millennium BC, smiths in the Near East cracked the code. They learned that if you work the metal while hot, hammering it repeatedly, folding it, heating it again, you could create something stronger than bronze had ever been. They discovered that if you heated iron with carbon, quenched it properly, you could make it hold an edge that bronze could never match. The knowledge spread slowly northward, carried by trade routes and migrating peoples, until it reached the communities of Central Europe. The Hallstatt people seized upon this technology with remarkable speed. Within a few generations, iron was everywhere. Iron axes cleared forests faster than bronze ever could. Iron ploughshares turned soil more efficiently, allowing more intensive agriculture. Iron tools meant craftsmen could work with greater precision, could shape wood and stone with new authority. Every farmer could have iron implements. Every warrior could carry an iron sword. This was democratization through technology. Bronze weapons had been the privilege of elites. Iron weapons could arm entire populations. A village that once could equip only its chief and his retinue could now field dozens of warriors. Tribes that once depended on trading networks, controlled by others, could now produce their own tools and weapons from local ore. The balance of power became more fluid, more contested, more violent. The Iron Age Celts, for this is when we can truly begin to speak of them as Celts, became masters of this new metal. Their smiths were renowned across Europe. They developed techniques for pattern welding, creating blades with distinctive wavy patterns, by forging together rods of different iron and steel. They created swords that were not just weapons but works of art, with elaborate hilts and scabbards decorated in styles that would become distinctively Celtic. They made chainmail, tiny iron rings linked together into flexible armour that could stop a sword stroke while allowing freedom of movement, an innovation that Romans would later adopt. Iron gave the Celts power. It gave them the tools to clear forests and create farmland, to build defences, to wage war effectively. It made them rich and made them dangerous. And with this power, they began to expand beyond their alpine heartlands, carrying their culture and their technologies outward like ripples spreading across still water. A day at the hill fort. You wake in darkness to the sound of cattle lowing in their pens below. The air inside the roundhouse is thick with the smell of wood smoke and sleeping bodies. Your breath comes out in clouds. It is early autumn, and the morning cold has begun to bite. Around you, your family still sleeps on benches covered with furs. The central hearth holds only embers now, glowing faintly in the gloom. You rise quietly, wrapping your woolen cloak tighter. Your feet touch the packed earth floor. It is smooth and hard, worn down by years of footsteps. You step carefully over the sleeping forms and push aside the leather hanging that covers the doorway. Outside, the hill fort is coming to life. You stand atop a defensive rampart made of earth and stone, part of a settlement that crowns the summit of a prominent hill. Below, layers of defensive walls circle the slopes. Beyond them, the forest stretches away in all directions, broken only by cleared fields where barley and wheat grow. Morning mist hangs in the valleys, and you can hear the distant call of a horn from a neighbouring settlement miles away. Other people are emerging from their roundhouses. Smoke begins to rise from cook fires. You smell porridge cooking, that thick barley porridge that will sustain you through the morning's work. A blacksmith's hammer begins to ring, metal on metal, a sound that will continue throughout the day. Dogs bark and chase each other between the houses. Children emerge, rubbing sleep from their eyes. You walk to the communal well at the centre of the fort. The wooden bucket descends on its rope, and you hear the splash as it hits water far below. You haul it up, and the water is cold enough to make your teeth ache when you drink. It tastes of earth and stone. The sun is rising now, burning through the mist. You can see the full extent of the settlement. Perhaps 30 roundhouses within the inner ramparts, more scattered outside. 200 people call this place home. You know them all. The smith with the scarred hands. The old woman who knows which herbs cure which ailments. The young warriors who practice with wooden swords every afternoon, dreaming of glory. The druid who visits 3 times a year to judge disputes and remember the genealogies. Your work today is repair work on the ramparts. Winter is coming, and the earthworks need to be solid before the rains begin. You join a crew of others, and together you dig and carry, strengthening the defences that keep this community safe. It is hard work. Your hands blister, your back aches, but there is satisfaction in it, in making something strong, in contributing to the collective safety. At midday, you rest and eat bread and cheese, washing it down with small beer. The conversation is of harvests and marriages, of a cattle raid 2 valleys over, of whether the winter will be harsh. Someone mentions that traders came through last week with news from the south. Stories of great cities, where stone buildings tower higher than the tallest oak, where thousands of people live pressed together. You find this hard to imagine. Your world is this hill fort, the surrounding forests, the neighbouring settlements within a day's walk. Beyond that lies mystery. As evening comes and you return to your roundhouse, the settlement settles into a comfortable routine. Cook fires glow, people gather to share food and stories. A bard begins to play, and you listen to tales of ancient heroes, of cattle raids and vengeance, of love and betrayal and honour. The words are beautiful, carefully crafted, passed down through generations. This is how your people remember. This is how they stay connected to the past. You fall asleep with the sound of the bard's voice in your ears, secure within your walls, part of a community that extends back into the mists of time and forward into an unknowable future. The Latin transformation. Around 450 BC, something changed in the artistic soul of the Celtic peoples. Historians call it the transition from Hallstatt to Latin culture, named after an archaeological site on the shores of Lake Neuchâtel in Switzerland. But this dry nomenclature disguises something profound, something that marked the Celts as a distinct civilization with their own aesthetic vision. The art changed. Where Hallstatt designs had been geometric, relatively simple patterns that echoed Mediterranean influences, Latin art became something else entirely. It became distinctively, unmistakably Celtic. Imagine curves that flow and spiral, that seem to move even when fixed in metal. Imagine abstract patterns that suggest faces or animals without quite depicting them, that play tricks on the eye, that reward sustained attention with hidden details. Imagine a visual language that valued ambiguity and transformation, where a curve might be a wave, or a leaf, or a tendril, or all 3 at once. This art appeared everywhere. On swords and scabbards, where warriors could look down and see swirling patterns that reminded them of their identity. On torques, those distinctive neck rings that became the quintessential Celtic jewellery, heavy circles of twisted gold or bronze with elaborately decorated terminals. On shields and helmets, on pottery and metalwork, on anything that could be decorated. The Latin style was not just decoration, it was a statement of identity, a way of seeing the world. What drove this artistic revolution? Scholars debate the question still. Some point to increased contact with Mediterranean civilizations, to Greek and Etruscan artistic influences, filtered through Celtic sensibilities, and transformed into something new. Others see it as an organic development from within, a maturing of Celtic culture expressing itself visually. Still others connect it to spiritual beliefs, suggesting that the swirling, Transformative patterns reflected Druidic ideas about the fluidity of existence, the interconnection of all things, the constant dance between order and chaos. Whatever its origins, Latin art spoke to something deep in Celtic culture. It rejected the rigid geometry of Mediterranean art. It avoided the literal representation that characterized Greek pottery. Instead, it embraced suggestion and transformation. An animal might dissolve into scrollwork. A face might hide within a pattern of spirals. The eye was never allowed to rest. It was always drawn into the dance of curves. Look at the Gundestrup cauldron, discovered in a Danish peat bog but created by Celtic craftsmen, probably in the 2nd or 1st century BC. It is a masterpiece of Latin style. Silver panels show gods and warriors, animals and rituals, all rendered in that distinctive Celtic manner. The figures are stylized, their proportions strange to classical eyes. But the overall effect is mesmerizing, powerful, unlike anything produced in the Mediterranean world. Or consider the Battersea shield, pulled from the Thames River in London. It was never meant for combat. The bronze is too thin, too ornate. This was ceremonial, meant to be seen, to impress, to display wealth and taste. The design features circular bosses, surrounded by flowing curves and spiral patterns, inlaid with red glass. Light plays across it differently, depending on the angle, creating the illusion of movement. This artistic flowering coincided with Celtic expansion. As Celtic peoples spread across Europe, they carried this distinctive visual language with them. You could find Latin-style metalwork from Ireland to Transylvania, from Spain to Bohemia. It became a marker of Celtic identity, a way for far-flung communities to recognize kinship, even when separated by vast distances. The artistry extended beyond metalwork. Celtic craftsmen excelled at enameling, fusing colored glass to metal to create brilliant reds and yellows, and blues that caught the light. They mastered the creation of chain mail, linking thousands of tiny iron rings into flexible armor. They produced exquisite glasswork, creating beads and vessels with sophisticated techniques. They carved stone with skill and imagination, creating monuments that still stand today. This was a culture coming into its own, finding its voice, expressing its worldview through art that was simultaneously sophisticated and primal, controlled and wild. The Latin transformation was not just about aesthetics. It was about identity, about becoming consciously Celtic, about creating a shared visual language that would unite peoples across vast territories. In their swirling curves and hidden faces, in their preference for suggestion over statement, the Celts were announcing themselves to the world. Waves across Europe, the expansion began gradually, almost imperceptibly, then gathered momentum like water flowing downhill. From their heartlands in what is now Austria, Switzerland, and southern Germany, Celtic peoples began to move outward in the centuries around 500 BC, not as conquering armies, not usually, but as migrants seeking new lands, as warriors offering their services, as traders and craftsmen carrying their skills to new markets. They moved west into what would become France, a land the Romans would later call Gaul. The territory was not empty. However, other peoples lived there, farmed there, had their own cultures and languages. But the arriving Celts brought with them superior iron technology, more effective weapons, perhaps more aggressive warrior cultures. Some communities were conquered, others were absorbed peacefully, adopting Celtic language and customs, intermarrying, gradually becoming Celtic themselves. The process was complex, varied from region to region, took centuries to complete. But by 400 BC, the land we call France was predominantly Celtic, in language, culture, and identity. They moved north into the territory that would become Belgium and the Netherlands, into the misty forests of what would later be called Germany. They crossed the narrow sea to Britain, arriving in waves over centuries, settling first in the south and east, gradually pushing westward and northward. The British Isles, which had their own ancient populations, became increasingly Celticized. The native peoples learned Celtic languages, adopted Celtic metalworking techniques, built hill forts in the Celtic style. By the time Romans arrived in Britain, they found a thoroughly Celtic culture, though with regional variations that spoke of complex interactions between newcomers and natives. They moved south, into the Italian peninsula itself. The valley of the Po River, in what is now northern Italy, became home to Celtic tribes the Romans called Cisalpine Gauls, the Gauls on this side of the Alps. These Celts established themselves within sight of Roman territory, close enough to trade with Rome, close enough to threaten it. The Romans viewed them with a mixture of fascination and fear, these tall barbarians with their strange customs and formidable warriors. They moved east, up the Danube Valley, into the broad plains and mountains of Central and Eastern Europe. Celtic settlements appeared in Bohemia, in what is now the Czech Republic. They moved into the Carpathian Basin, into Transylvania. They established themselves in the Balkans, coming into contact with Greek colonies on the northern shores of the Aegean Sea. Some went further, crossing into Anatolia, modern Turkey, establishing themselves there in a region that would be known as Galatia. And they moved west, to the very edge of the known world, to the Atlantic coast, to the storm-swept shores of what would become Portugal and Spain. Celtic tribes established themselves throughout the Iberian Peninsula, mixing with local populations, creating hybrid cultures. The Celtiberians, as they would be called, combined Celtic and Iberian traditions into something unique. This expansion was not coordinated. There was no Celtic empire, no central authority directing population movements. The Celts never united under a single leader or government. They remained tribal, each group autonomous, often at war with neighbouring Celtic tribes as much as with non-Celtic peoples. What united them was language, though even this varied into distinct dialects. What united them was culture, shared artistic styles, similar social structures, common religious beliefs. What united them was a certain worldview, a particular way of organising society, of understanding, honour and obligation, of relating to the divine. By 300 BC, Celtic-speaking peoples dominated most of Western and Central Europe. From the Atlantic to the Black Sea, from the Scottish Highlands to northern Italy, Celtic was the dominant culture, Celtic languages the most widely spoken. If you had travelled across Europe in that era, you would have found similar hill forts, similar artistic styles, similar social organisations, similar gods worshipped under different names. But this dominance was always fragile. The Celts' greatest strength was their adaptability, their willingness to absorb new ideas and peoples. Their greatest weakness was their inability to unite, to put aside tribal rivalries for common cause. They spread like water across Europe, filling every available space, but like water, they lacked the cohesion to resist a determined assault. When Rome began its expansion northward, when Germanic tribes pressed from the east, the Celts would find that cultural unity, without political unity, was not enough. But that reckoning lay in the future. For now, in the 4th and 3rd centuries BC, the Celts were ascendant, confident, expanding. They were reshaping Europe in their image, creating a cultural sphere that would influence the continent for millennia to come. And occasionally, they reminded the Mediterranean world of their power in spectacular fashion. The sack of Rome. When barbarians took the Eternal City, the Romans never forgot the 18th of July, 390 BC. That date burned itself into their collective memory, became a byword for disaster, shaped their attitudes toward northern barbarians for centuries to come. It was the day the city of Rome fell to Celtic warriors, the day the Senones sacked the Eternal City. The Senones were a Gallic tribe who had crossed the Alps and settled in northern Italy, in the Po Valley. They were looking for land, for opportunity, and they were willing to fight for it. Their leader was a man the Romans called Brennus, though whether this was truly his name or simply the Celtic word for chief, we cannot know. He appears in the historical record suddenly, like a thunderclap, leading his warriors south into Roman territory. The immediate cause was a dispute over land near the Etruscan city of Clusium. The Clusians, threatened by the Senones, appealed to Rome for help. Rome sent ambassadors to negotiate, but the negotiations went disastrously wrong. The Roman ambassadors, forgetting their diplomatic status, actually joined the Etruscan forces in a skirmish against the Senones. This violation of sacred custom enraged Brennus. He demanded the Romans surrender the ambassadors for punishment. Rome refused. It was an act of spectacular arrogance. War became inevitable. The Roman army marched out to meet the threat. They met the Senones at the river Allia, just 11 miles from Rome. The Romans were confident. They outnumbered the Celts, or so they believed. They had superior discipline, organisation, the tactical innovations that had made them masters of central Italy. What could these northern barbarians do against Roman legions? The battle was a catastrophe. The Celtic warriors attacked with terrifying ferocity. They were tall men, taller than most Romans. They wore their hair long and spiked it with lime until it stood up in wild crests. Some fought naked, believing their courage made them invulnerable, their pale bodies painted with blue woad. They screamed as they charged, a sound that froze Roman blood. Their war trumpets, the carnix, blasted out notes that sounded like the bellowing of monstrous beasts. The Roman lines broke. Experienced soldiers who had faced Etruscans and Latins without flinching turned and fled from these howling northerners. Some ran for Rome, others fled to the nearby city of Veii. Many were cut down in the rout, butchered as they ran. It was not a battle. It was a slaughter. 3 days later, Brennus and his warriors reached Rome. The city was nearly defenceless. Most of the population had fled. The young men and women had retreated to the Capitoline Hill, the steep-sided fortress at the heart of Rome. Everyone else had scattered into the countryside or sought refuge in neighbouring cities. The Senones entered Rome and found it almost empty, a ghost city waiting to be plundered. They burned it. Most of Rome was wood in that era, timber buildings with thatch roofs. The Celts put it all to the torch. They looted systematically, taking everything of value. For 7 months they occupied the city, living in its ruins, stripping it of wealth. The defenders on the Capitoline Hill held out, but they could not drive the Celts away. Finally, Rome agreed to pay a ransom, 1,000 pounds of gold. It was an astronomical sum, an admission of utter defeat. The Romans gathered what gold they could find and brought it to be weighed. But even in this final humiliation, there was more to come. The Celts brought scales that were weighted unfairly. When the Romans protested, Brennus threw his sword onto the scales, adding its weight to the gold required. When the Romans objected, he spoke 3 words that would echo through Roman history. Vae victis. Woe to the conquered. The Romans paid. They gave everything they had demanded and more. Brennus took his warriors and his gold and returned north. Rome was left in ashes, its pride shattered, its sense of invincibility destroyed. The psychological wound was deep and permanent. For generations afterward, Romans lived with the fear of Gallic invasions, kept watchdogs on the Capitoline Hill because legend said the sacred geese had warned of a Gallic night attack during the siege. They built the Servian walls, massive fortifications that enclosed the city. They never forgot that their city had fallen, that barbarians had walked their streets as conquerors. The sack of Rome was a defining moment for both Romans and Celts. For Romans, it was a trauma that shaped their foreign policy, their attitude toward northern peoples, their determination never to be caught vulnerable again. For the Celts, it was a demonstration of their power, proof that even the greatest cities of the south could fall before their warriors. But it was also, perhaps, a warning they did not heed. They had shown Rome what they could do. In doing so, they had created an enemy that would never forget, never forgive, and would ultimately prove far more dangerous than they imagined. The forest path. The forest was everything. It covered the land from horizon to horizon, broken only by rivers and the clearings humans carved from the green. Oak and ash and beech rose like pillars supporting the sky. Their canopy filtered sunlight into a soft green glow that shifted with every breath of wind. Walk the forest path, and you walk in dappled shadow. Moss grows thick on the north side of trees, soft beneath your hand. Ferns uncurl from the forest floor, delicate and impossibly green. Somewhere nearby, water trickles over stone, a constant whisper that never quite becomes silence. The air smells of earth and growth, of fallen leaves composting slowly into soil, of bark and sap, and the complex chemistry of living wood. Mushrooms push up through the leaf litter in clusters, pale and strange. Somewhere a woodpecker hammers at a dead tree, the sound echoing through the stillness. Above, the wind moves through leaves, with a sound like distant conversation. You cannot make out words, but the voice is soothing, constant, older than any human speech. Birds call to one another, marking territory, seeking mates, warning of danger. A jay scolds from an upper branch, its voice harsh but somehow appropriate to the wildness of this place. Shafts of sunlight pierce the canopy here and there, illuminating clouds of pollen and dust motes that dance in the golden air. In these pools of light, wildflowers grow, taking advantage of the sun before the canopy closes over them again. Bluebells in spring, turning entire forest floors into lakes of colour. Wild garlic, pungent and vital, the path winds between ancient trees, following contours worn by generations of feet. Deer paths cross it, barely visible tracks leading to secret places deeper in the forest. You might glimpse them sometimes, still as statues in the shadows, watching you pass with liquid eyes. This is the world of the Celts, the green world, the wild world barely touched by human hands. The forest provides everything: wood for building and burning, game for hunting, herbs for healing, acorns for fattening pigs, and something else, something harder to name. A sense of the sacred, of powers older and stranger than humanity. The Druids know this. They know which trees are holy, which groves are special. They know the forest keeps its secrets. Walk slowly here. Let the peace of ancient growth settle into your bones. This forest has stood for thousands of years. It will stand for thousands more, green and growing, eternally renewing itself, caring nothing for the brief dramas of human history unfolding beneath its branches. Into the east, the Galatian adventure. While most Celtic migrations moved west and north, one group took an unexpected path that led them far from their European homelands into the exotic east. This is the story of how Celtic warriors ended up in Anatolia, in what is now central Turkey, establishing a kingdom that would survive for centuries and leave such an impression that the Apostle Paul would write a letter to their descendants more than 300 years later. It began as these things often did, with opportunity and violence. In the early decades of the 3rd century BC, the eastern Mediterranean was in chaos. Alexander the Great had died, and his generals were carving up his empire, fighting each other for dominance. The successor kingdoms, the Diadochi, needed soldiers. They needed mercenaries, men willing to fight for pay and plunder without concern for the political intricacies of Eastern politics. Celtic warriors had a reputation, word of their ferocity, their fearlessness in battle, their skill with weapons had spread throughout the Mediterranean. When recruiters came north looking for mercenaries, they found willing fighters among the Celtic tribes of the Danube and Balkans. In 279 BC, a large force of Celtic warriors, perhaps 20,000 strong, moved south into Greece itself. They were led by another Brennus, whether the actual name of their leader or simply the title given to great war chiefs. This Brennus was ambitious. He did not intend merely to serve as a mercenary. He aimed to plunder the wealthy Greek sanctuaries, to take for himself the accumulated treasures of centuries. His target was Delphi, the sacred shrine of Apollo, one of the holiest sites in the Greek world. The attack on Delphi failed, repulsed by desperate Greek defenders, and, according to Greek accounts, divine intervention in the form of earthquakes and boulders rolling down from the mountains. Brennus was wounded and later killed himself, rather than endure capture. But the Celtic invasion of Greece, though it failed to sack Delphi, terrified the Greeks. These were not normal invaders. They seemed to care nothing for the sacred, to fear nothing, to be moved only by the desire for gold and glory. Many of the surviving Celtic warriors took service with Nicomedes I, the king of Bithynia in northwestern Anatolia. He was fighting his brother for control of the kingdom and needed warriors who would be loyal only to gold, not swayed by family connections or political considerations. The Celts served him well, helped him secure his throne. As payment, Nicomedes granted them land in central Anatolia, a territory that would become known as Galatia. These Celts, far from their European homelands, maintained their identity with remarkable tenacity. They kept their Celtic language, a variation of the continental Celtic tongues spoken in Gaul. They maintained their tribal organization, dividing into 3 main tribes: the Trochmi, the Tolistobogi, and the Tectosages. They kept their warrior culture, their distinctive art styles, their social structures. Ancient writers described them as physically different from their Anatolian neighbours, taller, with lighter hair and skin, still looking like the Gauls they had descended from. Galatia became a power in its own right. The Galatians offered their services as mercenaries to various kingdoms, playing the successor states off against each other. They raided surrounding territories when it suited them, extracting tribute from fearful neighbours. For a time, they terrorised much of Anatolia, and Greek cities paid them protection money to avoid being sacked. Eventually, the Galatians settled into a more stable existence. They became farmers and herders as much as warriors. They built towns in the Anatolian style, adapted to local conditions while maintaining their Celtic identity. They intermarried with local populations but kept their language and customs dominant. They developed a reputation for being excellent metalworkers, maintaining the Celtic skill with iron and bronze. When Rome expanded eastward, Galatia came under Roman influence, eventually becoming a client kingdom and later a Roman province. But the Galatians never entirely disappeared. They maintained their Celtic speech into the 4th century AD, perhaps even later. When Paul wrote his letter to the Galatians around 50 AD, he was writing to the descendants of Celtic warriors who had journeyed east 3 centuries earlier, people who still maintained some connection to their ancient Celtic heritage, even while increasingly influenced by Greek and Roman culture. The Galatian story is a testament to Celtic adaptability and cultural persistence. A people could migrate thousands of miles from their homeland, settle in an entirely foreign environment, surrounded by different languages and cultures, and still maintain their identity for centuries. The Celts were not just geographically expansive, they were culturally resilient, able to bend without breaking, to adapt without disappearing. At least, for a time. The Greek perspective, barbarians or brothers. The Greeks noticed the Celts. How could they not? These tall, often boisterous northerners appeared with increasing frequency in Greek lands as the 4th and 3rd centuries BC progressed. They came as mercenaries, as raiders, as traders. They were foreign, exotic, disturbing, and like all ancient peoples encountering the strange and unfamiliar, the Greeks tried to make sense of them, to fit them into their understanding of the world. The Greek word for people who did not speak Greek was barbaros, barbarian, a term that imitated the incomprehensible sounds of foreign speech. Bar, bar, bar. It was not initially a term of contempt, merely a description. You were either Greek, Hellene, or you were barbaros, other. The Celts were most certainly barbaros. The Greeks called them Keltoi or Galatai, and they wrote about them with a mixture of fascination, fear, and condescension that tells us as much about Greek attitudes as about Celtic realities. Some Greek writers portrayed the Celts as noble savages, people uncorrupted by civilization's vices. They admired Celtic courage, their willingness to face death without flinching. They noted that Celtic warriors seemed to care more for honor and glory than for wealth or safety. They commented on Celtic hospitality, on the laws that governed their society, on their respect for eloquent speech. Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BC, but drawing on earlier sources, described the Celts as terrifying in appearance. They were, he wrote, tall and muscular, with skin white as milk. They wore their hair long and washed it with lime water, making it thick and coarse like a horse's mane. Some dyed their hair brilliant colours or spiked it up in elaborate styles. They cultivated long moustaches that drooped over their mouths. Their voices were harsh and loud. They loved to drink, to feast, to boast of their exploits. In battle, according to these Greek accounts, the Celts were both magnificent and terrifying. Some warriors fought completely naked, trusting in their courage and their gods to protect them. They wore heavy torques around their necks, often their only adornment. They carried large shields, often decorated with intricate designs. Their swords were long, designed for slashing rather than stabbing. They fought with passionate abandon, screaming challenges, engaging in single combat before the battle lines clashed. The Greeks found much to criticize. The Celts seemed to lack the discipline that characterized Greek warfare. They relied on individual heroism rather than coordinated tactics. Their society seemed primitive, tribal, without the sophisticated city-states that the Greeks considered the mark of true civilization. They were, in Greek eyes, emotional rather than rational, passionate rather than philosophical. Yet there was also grudging respect. The Celts had, after all, nearly sacked Delphi. They served as effective mercenaries in the armies of Hellenistic kings. They controlled vast territories in Europe. They could not be dismissed as merely primitive. Some Greek writers suggested that the Celts had their own form of philosophy embodied in their mysterious Druids. These Druids, the Greeks noted, taught doctrines about the immortality of the soul, about reincarnation, ideas not entirely foreign to Greek philosophical thought. Strabo, the geographer, wrote extensively about the Celts, describing their lands, their customs, their various tribes. He portrayed them as brave but somewhat foolish, quick to anger, and easily manipulated. He noted their love of gold ornaments, their custom of headhunting in warfare, their habit of preserving the heads of important enemies in cedar oil as trophies. He described their feasting customs, how they sat on hides spread on the ground, how they gave the best portion of meat to the bravest warrior, how disputes over precedence could lead to duels to the death. These Greek accounts are invaluable to us. They are almost the only written descriptions we have of the ancient Celts. Yet they must be read carefully, understood as the perspectives of outsiders trying to make sense of a foreign culture through the lens of their own assumptions and prejudices. The Greeks could not understand a society without cities, without written literature, without the institutions they considered essential to civilization. They struggled to comprehend a people who valued oral tradition over written records, who entrusted their laws and histories and religious knowledge to memory rather than writing. What emerges from these Greek texts is a picture of the Celts as the Greeks saw them: formidable, foreign, fascinating, and fundamentally other. They were powerful enough to be respected, strange enough to be exotic, different enough to serve as a useful contrast to Greek civilization. They were what Greeks were not. And in describing the Celts, the Greeks were also defining themselves. We must always remember this when we read ancient accounts of the Celts. We are seeing them through another's eyes that did not always understand what they were seeing, that sometimes feared, sometimes admired, but always saw from the outside. The Celts themselves left almost no written testimony. Their voices come to us, filtered through foreigners, who wrote in different languages, who had different assumptions, different goals. We must listen carefully, read between the lines, triangulate between different sources, cross-reference with archaeology, to begin to hear the authentic Celtic voice beneath the layers of Greek and Roman interpretation, the structure of Celtic society. To understand the Celts, you must first understand that they were not a nation in any sense we would recognize. They had no capital city, no central government, no king who ruled over all Celtic peoples. They were tribal, fiercely independent, organized at a local level in ways that must have seemed incomprehensible to Romans accustomed to their hierarchical state. At the foundation of Celtic society was the tribe, a group bound together by real or claimed kinship, by shared territory, by common ancestors, venerated as heroes or gods. A tribe might number a few thousand people, or many tens of thousands. It occupied a defined territory, defended that territory from others, and owed no allegiance to any higher authority. When Celtic tribes cooperated, it was through temporary alliances, personal relationships between chieftains, shared threats that forced collaboration. But such cooperation was fragile, easily dissolved when interests diverged. Within each tribe, society was stratified into three broad classes, a structure that appears across the Celtic world from Ireland to Galatia. At the top were the nobles, a warrior aristocracy that owned most of the land, controlled most of the wealth, and monopolized political and military power. These were the men, and occasionally women, who wore golden torques, who rode into battle on chariots or horseback, who hosted great feasts, who competed for prestige and followers. Nobility was not simply inherited, though birth certainly mattered. It had to be maintained through demonstration of valor, generosity, and eloquence. A noble was expected to be brave in battle, generous to his followers, eloquent in speech. He was expected to host feasts, to give gifts, to maintain a household that reflected his status. A noble who failed in these duties lost prestige, lost followers, could fall from his position. Celtic nobility was earned as much as inherited. Alongside the warrior nobility stood another elite class, the Druids. These learned men, and we know there were Druidesses as well, occupied a unique position in Celtic society. They were not warriors, though they often came from noble families. They were not rulers, though their influence on rulers was profound. They were the keepers of knowledge, the preservers of tradition, the mediators between the human and divine. Druids spent 20 years in training, memorizing vast amounts of poetry, law, genealogy, history, and religious doctrine. They were judges, settling disputes according to traditional law. They were teachers, educating the children of nobles. They were priests, conducting sacrifices and interpreting omens. They were philosophers, developing complex ideas about the nature of existence, the immortality of the soul, the structure of the cosmos, and critically, They refused to write any of this down. All Druidic knowledge was oral, memorized, passed from teacher to student across generations. The relationship between Druids and nobles was complex. Druids could advise chieftains, could bless or curse undertakings, could declare someone outside the law by banning them from sacrifices. Yet they held no military power themselves, owned no armies, could not compel obedience through force. Their authority was moral and spiritual, dependent on the belief that they understood sacred things, that they could mediate with the gods, that their judgments carried divine sanction. Below these two elite classes was everyone else: farmers, herders, craftsmen, labourers, the common people, the plebs. They owned some property, had some rights, but were largely subject to the nobles above them. Many were clients, bound to a noble patron through relationships of mutual obligation. The patron provided protection, legal representation, support in times of hardship. The client provided labour, military service when called, political support, loyalty. This client relationship was fundamental to Celtic society. A noble's power was measured not just by the land he owned, but by the number of clients he could claim. Clients swelled his warband, worked his lands, supported his political ambitions. In return, the noble had sacred obligations to protect and support his clients. To fail in this duty was dishonourable, could lead to clients transferring their loyalty to another lord. At the very bottom were slaves, captured in war or born into servitude. They had no rights, were property to be bought and sold, worked and exploited. Yet even slavery among the Celts seems to have been less harsh than in Mediterranean societies. Slaves could sometimes earn or buy their freedom, could be freed as gifts by generous masters, might even rise to positions of some responsibility within their owner's household. Women in Celtic society occupied a complex position. They were not equals to men, but neither were they as restricted as women in Greek or Roman society. Some women inherited property, ruled as queens, fought as warriors. We hear of female Druids, though they are mentioned rarely. Most women's lives revolved around household management, raising children, weaving, and food preparation. But the laws that survive, particularly from Ireland, suggest that women had property rights, could divorce abusive husbands, could engage in certain types of commerce. What bound these various classes together was a complex web of obligations, of duties owed and expected, of honour maintained through proper behaviour. Celtic society ran not on written law codes, but on custom, on precedent, on the judgments of Druids who remembered how similar cases had been decided in the past. It was personal rather than bureaucratic, based on relationships rather than institutions. It was a society that would have seemed chaotic to a Roman administrator, yet it functioned for centuries, providing stability within its own terms, creating meaning and order for millions of people across vast territories. Warriors and war bands. War was not simply an activity for the Celts. It was a defining characteristic, a cultural institution, almost an art form. Celtic society was organised around warfare, glorified warriors above all other callings, and developed a complex culture of combat that mixed practical military effectiveness with ritual and display. The Celtic warrior was instantly recognisable. He was typically taller than Mediterranean men, his height emphasised by hair styled upward, with limewash, standing in stiff peaks or wild tangles. So many warriors bleached their hair to make it even more striking, so that blonde or red manes crowned heads in battle. They grew long moustaches that drooped dramatically, sometimes braiding them, sometimes letting them grow so long they had to be held back while eating. Their bodies were muscular from constant training, from lives spent outdoors in physical labour and practice combat. Their equipment was both functional and expressive. The Celtic shield was large, usually oval or elongated, hexagonal, made of wood covered with leather and often adorned with bronze fittings. The central boss could be used as a weapon, smashed into an opponent's face. Shields were decorated with swirling lateen patterns, painted in bright colours, made to catch the eye and display the warrior's identity and taste. The Celtic sword was a masterwork of the smith's craft. Long, designed primarily for slashing rather than stabbing, these swords were often pattern-welded, made from multiple rods of iron and steel, forged together to create flexible blades that held an edge. The hilts were elaborate, decorated with precious metals, enamel, amber, The scabbards were works of art in themselves, covered in intricate designs. These were not just weapons, they were status symbols, heirlooms passed from father to son, named and storied. Spears were common, perhaps more common than swords for many warriors. Some were throwing spears, light javelins hurled at the enemy before close combat. Others were heavy thrusting spears for close fighting. The heads were iron, often decorated, sometimes bearing maker's marks or owner's symbols. A forest of spear points advancing made a terrifying sight. Some warriors wore armour. Chainmail, that Celtic invention of thousands of tiny iron rings linked together, was expensive but effective, providing protection while allowing movement. Bronze or iron helmets, topped with crests or horns, made warriors appear taller, more imposing. The wealthiest might wear bronze breastplates, elaborately decorated to display their status. But many warriors, particularly the young and reckless, disdained armour altogether, fighting naked or nearly so, trusting in their courage and their gods to protect them. Before battle, warriors prepared themselves psychologically as much as physically. They worked themselves into a frenzy, shouting and chanting, boasting of their deeds and their ancestors' deeds, challenging enemy champions to single combat. They blew war trumpets, the carnix, bronze instruments shaped like fierce animal heads that emitted harsh, braying sounds meant to terrify enemies and summon supernatural aid. The Celtic way of war was intensely personal. Before armies clashed, champions would step forward to engage in single combat while both sides watched. These duels were not to the death necessarily, though they could be. They were displays, chances to gain glory, to demonstrate courage, to intimidate opponents. A warrior who defeated a renowned champion, gained immense prestige, could boast of the deed for the rest of his life, would be honoured in songs sung at feasts. When battle was joined, it was chaotic by Roman standards. There was less emphasis on maintaining formation, more on individual combat. Warriors sought out worthy opponents, tried to achieve notable kills. The taking of heads was common practice. A slain enemy's head was a trophy, proof of valour, sometimes imbued with spiritual power. Heads were taken from the battlefield, preserved, displayed in homes or temples. The skulls of particularly notable enemies might be bound in bronze, turned into drinking vessels. Cattle raiding was a constant feature of Celtic life, almost a sport for young warriors. A successful raid brought wealth in the form of cattle, the primary measure of riches in many Celtic societies. It brought glory to those who participated. The great Irish epic, the Tan Bo Cúailnge, the cattle raid of Cooley, revolves around a massive raid to steal a prize bull. The story, though written down in the Middle Ages, preserves much older traditions of what cattle raiding meant to Celtic warriors. Warriors travelled in war bands, bound to a particular leader, through oaths of loyalty. These bands were the core of Celtic military forces, groups of men who fought together, trained together, feasted together. Loyalty within the war band was sacred. A warrior was expected to defend his chief to the death, to avenge him if he fell. In return, the chief rewarded his warriors with gifts, with portions of plunder, with cattle and gold rings and elaborate weapons. The warband was also a school for young nobles. Boys entered a chief's household as teenagers, learned to fight under experienced warriors, absorbed the values of courage, loyalty, and honour that defined Celtic masculinity. They heard songs of ancient heroes, learned to boast effectively, competed for the chief's favour. A young man might spend years in such service before establishing his own household, building his own following. Yet Celtic warfare was not only about glory and display. It was also strategic, adaptive, effective. Celtic warriors used terrain cleverly, ambushing Roman columns in forests where formation fighting was impossible. They built formidable fortifications, hill forts with multiple defensive walls that could shelter entire communities during attacks. They were skilled at guerrilla tactics, at hit-and-run raids, at avoiding pitched battle when outnumbered or outmatched. The problem was unity. Celtic tribes fought each other as often as they fought outsiders. Feuds could last for generations. Alliances were temporary, easily broken. A shared language and culture did not translate into political cooperation. When faced with a unified, disciplined enemy like Rome, this disunity proved fatal. Individual valour and tactical skill could not overcome organised, sustained military pressure. The very individualism that Celtic culture celebrated, that made their warriors so formidable in single combat, prevented them from uniting effectively against existential threats. But for centuries, Celtic warriors dominated the battlefields of Europe. They were feared by Romans, respected by Greeks, hired as mercenaries by Eastern kings. They developed a martial culture, as sophisticated and complex as any in the ancient world, and that culture shaped Celtic society at every level, defined what it meant to be a Celtic man, created the values and ideals that gave life meaning. You stand in the shield wall. The warband gathers at dawn. You have been awake for hours already, too nervous to sleep, checking and rechecking your weapons. Your stomach is tight with anticipation and fear, though you would never admit the fear. Around you, other warriors make their own preparations. Some are silent, turned inward. Others are loud, joking, boasting, working themselves toward the necessary frenzy. Your shield is heavy on your left arm. It is painted with spirals, red and black on white. Your father carried this shield before you. He died with it, and it came back to you with his blood, still dark in the grain of the wood. You have repaired it, reinforced it, added your own marks to its surface. It is more than protection. It is identity, legacy, responsibility. Your sword hangs at your side. You draw it, checking the edge one more time. The blade catches the early light, shows the subtle patterns of its forging. You named it last night, in the ritual before battle. Iron Tongue, you called it. Let it speak for you when words fail. The enemy is across the valley. You cannot see them clearly yet, but you can hear them. Drums, chanting. The sounds carry in the still morning air. They are working themselves up, just as you are. The space between the two armies seems to pulse with tension, with the violence waiting to be born. Your chief walks along the line. He wears a golden torque that gleams against his bare chest. He has painted himself blue, the sacred colour, invoking the protection of the gods. His voice is strong as he speaks. He reminds you of ancient victories. He names your ancestors, heroes whose deeds are sung at every feast. He tells you that today you will join them, that today you will earn glory that will be remembered. The war trumpets sound. The Carnix, bronze animal heads roaring their harsh challenge. The sound goes through you like lightning. Other warriors begin to scream, to beat swords against shields. The noise builds, a crescendo of fury and determination. You add your voice to the din, screaming challenges you hope the enemy can hear, working yourself toward the necessary state where fear dissolves into rage. The line begins to move forward. Slowly at first, shields overlap, forming a wall of wood and leather and iron bosses. You can smell the man next to you, sweat and the fatty smell of the grease in his hair. His breathing is loud, rapid. Your own breath comes hard. The weight of the shield seems to increase with every step. The enemy comes into focus. They are closer now, close enough to see faces, to see individual warriors. They look terrifying, their own shields painted with strange symbols, their weapons bright and sharp, their eyes wide with the same mixture of fear and fury you feel. For a moment, time seems to slow. You can see everything with preternatural clarity. The pattern on an enemy shield, the way sunlight catches on spear points, a raven circling overhead, waiting for the feast to come. Then the lines crash together, and thought ceases. You slam your shield into the enemy wall. The impact jars your arm, sends shock through your shoulder. A spear thrusts at your face. You deflect it with your shield. Feel the point scrape across wood. You thrust your own sword over the rim of your shield. Feel it connect with something soft. Hear a scream. The world narrows to the space directly in front of you. Push, strike, deflect, push again. The man beside you is screaming continuously, a wordless sound of effort and rage. Behind you, someone is shouting encouragement, obscenities, prayers, all mixed together. Your arm is already tired from holding the shield. Sweat runs into your eyes. You cannot see the larger battle. You can only see the few feet in front of you, the enemy warriors trying to kill you, the points of weapons seeking gaps in your defense. Time loses meaning. It could have been minutes or hours. Your world is the shield wall, the press of bodies, the endless cycle of thrust and deflect and push. Somewhere, someone breaks. The enemy line gives way, just for a moment. The warriors around you surge forward into the gap. You go with them, carried by momentum and the collective will of the warband. The formation dissolves into individual combats, into the chaos of melee. This is when it becomes personal. You face an enemy warrior, just you and him. He lunges. You parry. Your feet find the ground instinctively. Balance without thought. Iron tongue moves almost by itself, guided by training, by instinct, by desperation. The other warrior stumbles. You press the advantage. Your blade finds his throat. He falls. You stand over him, breathing hard, shaking with spent adrenaline. Around you, the battle continues. But for this moment, you have survived. You have killed an enemy. You will have a story to tell at the feast tonight. If there is a feast, if you live that long, but that is later. Now there is only breath and blood and the knowledge that you stood in the shield wall and did not break. The artisan's hand. Celtic metalwork. The smith was special. He occupied a place in Celtic society somewhere between the common craftsman and the Druidic elite. He worked with fire and metal, transformed rock into weapons and ornament, possessed knowledge that seemed almost magical. A good smith was valued, patronized by nobles, sometimes exempted from military service, because his skills were too precious to risk in battle. The smith's forge was a place of heat and noise and creation. Bellows forced air into the fire, raising temperatures high enough to make iron glow orange and then white. The smith watched the metal with experienced eyes, knowing exactly when it reached the right temperature for working. Too cool, and the metal would crack when hammered. Too hot, and it would become grainy, weak, prone to failure. The process of creating a sword took weeks. First came the preparation of the iron, smelting ore in a bloomery furnace, hammering out the slag and impurities. Different qualities of iron and steel had to be prepared, some harder, some more flexible. For a pattern-welded blade, rods of iron and steel were bundled together, heated until they could be forge-welded, hammer-welded, into a single piece. The smith folded the metal, twisted it, welded it again, creating layers that gave the blade strength and flexibility. The blade was shaped through endless hammering, each blow carefully placed, gradually forming the profile, the taper, the edge. It was heated and reheated dozens of times. Apprentices worked the bellows, maintained the fire, handed tools to the master smith. The sound of hammer on anvil rang across the settlement, a rhythm as steady as a heartbeat. When the blade was shaped, it had to be hardened. This was the moment of greatest danger, when a mistake could ruin weeks of work. The blade was heated one last time to precisely the right temperature, judged by the colour of the glowing metal. Then it was quenched, plunged into water or oil, or sometimes urine, each liquid giving slightly different properties to the steel. The blade emerged harder, capable of holding an edge, but also more brittle. It had to be tempered, reheated to a lower temperature, and cooled again, to restore some flexibility, to prevent it from shattering in use. The finished blade was a thing of beauty. Pattern-welded swords showed distinctive, wavy patterns on their surfaces, the layers of different metals creating flowing designs that seemed to ripple in the light. The edge was sharp enough to shave hair. The balance was perfect, the sword moving as an extension of the warrior's arm. This was not just a weapon, this was art. But swords were only one product of the smith's craft. Celtic metalworkers created an astonishing variety of objects, each showing sophisticated understanding of materials and techniques. They made chainmail, linking thousands of tiny iron rings into flexible armour. Each ring had to be formed, its ends flattened and riveted closed. A single shirt of mail might contain 20,000 rings, representing hundreds of hours of painstaking work. They created torques, those distinctive Celtic neck rings that became almost a uniform for Celtic nobles. Torques were made from twisted rods of gold or bronze, sometimes hollow, sometimes solid, always with elaborately decorated terminals. The best examples, like the Snettisham Great Torque found in England, are masterworks of the jeweller's art, kilograms of gold twisted into complex patterns, with terminals showing human faces emerging from scrollwork. Celtic craftsmen excelled at enamelling, fusing coloured glass to metal to create brilliant decorative effects. They developed techniques for creating cells in bronze, filling them with glass paste, and heating the piece until the glass fused to the metal. The result was jewellery and decorative metalwork that shimmered with reds and blues and yellows, colours that caught light and drew the eye. Their mirrors were famous, bronze discs polished to a reflective finish, the backs decorated with swirling lateen designs. The Desborough mirror, found in England, shows the height of Celtic artistry. Its back is covered with flowing curves, spirals within spirals, patterns that seem to move and transform as you look at them. The design is mathematically precise, yet looks organic, natural, as if it grew rather than being planned. Shields were not merely functional, but also beautiful. The Battersea shield, though too thin for actual combat, shows what Celtic craftsmen could do when creating ceremonial weapons. Its bronze surface features raised bosses, connected by flowing curves inlaid with red glass. The design is perfectly balanced, symmetrical yet dynamic. Water damaged it before it was deposited in the Thames, but even now, more than 2,000 years later, it is stunning. The craft skills were passed from master to apprentice, knowledge carefully guarded, techniques refined over generations. Young men entered a smith's household, spent years learning the mysteries of metal. They learned which ores were richest. They learned the temperatures needed for different operations. They learned the rituals and prayers that accompanied the work, because metalworking was not merely technical, it was also sacred, a transformation of earth into objects of power and beauty. Celtic metalwork spread across Europe with Celtic culture. You could find Latin-style objects from Ireland to Romania, from Spain to Scotland. The distinctive swirling patterns, the sophisticated techniques, the aesthetic sense that valued ambiguity and transformation, all marked these objects as Celtic. They were more than pretty things. They were statements of identity, ways of saying, we are Celtic people, connections to a shared culture that transcended tribal boundaries. And they were functional. Celtic weapons were effective, designed for real combat. Celtic tools were well made, durable, suited to their purposes. Celtic jewellery was meant to be worn, to display status, to serve as portable wealth. The Celts created beauty, but they created beauty that worked, that served practical purposes while also feeding the soul's need for aesthetic pleasure. The Vix Princess. In 1953, a farmer was expanding his vineyard near the small village of Vix in northeastern France. His tools struck something hard beneath the soil. What he had found would revolutionize our understanding of Celtic society and the role of women within it. The excavation revealed a burial chamber, carefully constructed and protected by a massive tumulus, an earthen mound raised over the grave. The burial dated to around 500 BC, right at the transition from Hallstatt to Latin culture. Inside lay the body of a woman, perhaps 30 to 35 years old at death. She had been laid out with extraordinary care and surrounded by wealth that suggested power and status of the highest order. She wore a golden torque around her neck, a massive piece weighing almost half a kilogram, decorated with winged horses at its terminals. On her wrists were bronze bracelets. Amber and lignite jewellery adorned her clothing. Her body had been placed on a ceremonial wagon, its wheels removed and placed beside her. The wagon itself was a marvel, decorated with bronze fittings, designed for display rather than practical transport. But the most spectacular object was the crater. A crater is a large Greek vessel used for mixing wine with water, following the Greek custom of diluting wine before drinking. The Vix crater is the largest bronze vessel to survive from the ancient world. It stands over 160 centimetres tall, weighs more than 200 kilograms. Its rim is decorated with a frieze showing warriors and chariots. Its handles feature gorgon heads. It came from a Greek workshop, probably in southern Italy or Sicily, and must have been disassembled and transported hundreds of miles north to reach Vix. Who was this woman? We do not know her name. We can only infer from her burial. The wealth buried with her speaks of high status, perhaps a queen or chieftain in her own right. The Greek imports suggest far-reaching trade connections, diplomatic relationships with Mediterranean powers. She was clearly someone important enough that her community invested enormous resources in her funeral, that foreign dignitaries, or traders, sent gifts appropriate for royalty. The Vix burial challenged assumptions about Celtic women. Ancient sources, written by Greek and Roman men from patriarchal societies, tended to portray Celtic women in limited roles. But the archaeology told a different story. Here was a woman buried with all the markers of supreme authority. No male burial received greater honour. No grave in the region contained more spectacular goods. Other high-status female burials have since been found across the Celtic world. The Rheinheim burial in Germany contained a woman interred with a golden torque, elaborate jewellery, and a bronze mirror. The Waldalgesheim burial, also in Germany, revealed another woman surrounded by gold and sophisticated metalwork. A pattern emerged. Celtic women could hold positions of power, could own substantial wealth, could be honoured in death as equals to male leaders. Written sources, when read carefully, support this archaeological evidence. Greek and Roman writers mention Celtic queens who ruled territories, commanded armies, negotiated treaties. Cartimandua ruled the Brigantes in northern Britain. Boudica led a massive rebellion against Rome in 60 AD. Irish mythology is full of powerful queens and female warriors. These may have been exceptional women, but their existence suggests that Celtic society allowed for female authority in ways Mediterranean cultures did not. The Vix princess, as she is now known, though we cannot be certain she was an actual princess, lies in the museum at Châtillon-sur-Seine. Her golden torque is displayed nearby, still brilliant after 2,500 years. The massive crater dominates its gallery. An improbable object that travelled so far, cost so much, was valued enough to be buried rather than kept for the living. Together, these objects tell a story of a woman who mattered, whose death was a significant event, whose community honoured her memory with the finest goods they could acquire. In her grave, we glimpse a Celtic world, more complex, more egalitarian in some ways than ancient sources suggested. The mystery of the Druids. Of all aspects of Celtic culture, none has captured imagination more than the Druids. These mysterious figures, priests and philosophers and judges, emerge from ancient sources shrouded in contradictions. They were central to Celtic religion, keepers of vast knowledge, holders of political and spiritual authority, yet they left almost nothing behind directly, no texts in their own hand, no temples that definitively belonged to them. We must reconstruct who they were, from hostile sources, from later medieval literature, from archaeology that hints but rarely proves. The word Druid probably derives from Celtic roots meaning something like oak knowledge or very wise. They were the learned class of Celtic society, parallel to the warrior aristocracy but separate from it. Greek and Roman writers, despite their generally dismissive attitudes toward Celtic culture, consistently expressed awe at Druidic learning, acknowledging that these barbarian priests possessed genuine philosophical depth. The training of a Druid was epic in duration. 20 years, according to Julius Caesar, who encountered Druids during his conquest of Gaul. 20 years of memorization, of learning poetry and law and history and cosmology, of mastering the complex religious rituals that maintained right relationship with the gods. This knowledge was deliberately kept oral. Caesar writes that Druids refused to commit their learning to writing, though they knew Greek and used it for mundane purposes, like keeping accounts. Their sacred knowledge had to be memorized, had to live in human minds rather than dead marks on parchment. Why this prohibition on writing? Ancient sources suggest multiple reasons. Writing, they believed, weakened the memory. It was too easy to rely on written texts to stop the hard work of memorization that trained the mind. More profoundly, perhaps, Druidic knowledge was power, and power needed to be guarded. Written texts could be copied, stolen, distributed without control. Knowledge held in memory remained under the Druids' control, could be revealed or withheld, taught to the worthy and hidden from others. Druids served multiple roles in Celtic society. As priests, they conducted sacrifices, interpreted omens, mediated between the human and divine realms. They understood which rituals pleased, which gods, knew the proper prayers and offerings. They read signs in the flight of birds, in the movement of clouds, in the entrails of sacrificed animals. When communities faced decisions, they consulted Druids to learn the will of the gods. As judges, Druids were supreme authorities on law. Celtic law was traditional, unwritten, based on precedent and custom. Druids memorized legal decisions going back generations, could cite relevant cases, determine appropriate judgments. They settled disputes between individuals, between tribes, between regions. Their verdicts were binding because they carried divine authority. To defy a Druid's judgment was to risk supernatural punishment. The most severe punishment Druids could impose was exclusion from sacrifice. This seems mild to modern ears, but in a society where religion permeated every aspect of life, it was devastating. The excluded person could not participate in festivals, could not marry legally, could not enter into contracts. They were cut off from the community. from the protection of the gods, from normal social life. It was a form of death without killing. Druids also taught. The children of nobles were sent to Druids for education, learning poetry and oratory, genealogy and history, philosophy and astronomy. Druids gathered in sacred groves, places deep in forests where oak trees grew, where silence and mystery prevailed. Students came to these places, lived with Druids for years, absorbed knowledge through repetition and memorization. It was education through immersion, through constant exposure, through the forging of personal relationships between teachers and students. What did Druids believe? Greek and Roman sources hint at doctrines that interested classical philosophers. Druids taught that souls were immortal, that after death they passed into other bodies. This was not quite reincarnation, as Indian philosophy conceived it, but something similar. The soul might transfer to another human, or to an animal, or return to the divine realm before being born again. This belief, sources suggest, made Celtic warriors fearless in battle. Death was not an ending but a transition. To die bravely was to move forward in the soul's journey. Druids understood astronomy, tracked the movements of sun and moon, predicted eclipses, maintained calendars that regulated agricultural and religious activities. They perceived connections between earth and sky, believed that celestial events influenced earthly affairs. The Coligny calendar, a bronze tablet covered with Celtic inscriptions that organized time in complex patterns, suggests sophisticated astronomical knowledge encoded in religious frameworks. Human sacrifice appears repeatedly in sources describing Druids. Romans were horrified by reports of wicker men, huge figures woven from branches and filled with living people who were burned as offerings to the gods. Caesar describes Druids overseeing executions of criminals and war captives, claiming that the gods demanded human blood. Strabo mentions Druids shooting men with arrows, impaling them in temples, burning them alive. How much of this is true? How much is Roman propaganda, stories designed to make Celtic religion seem barbaric, to justify Roman conquest as a civilizing mission? Archaeological evidence confirms that human sacrifice occurred in Celtic cultures. Bog bodies, preserved in peat, show evidence of ritual killing. The Lindo man bore marks of a threefold death: struck on the head, strangled, throat cut, consistent with sacrificial execution. But the scale and frequency remain uncertain. Were human sacrifices rare, reserved for extreme circumstances, or were they common, routine aspects of religious practice? We cannot know for certain. Druids seem to have formed a kind of international network, recognizing each other across tribal boundaries, meeting periodically at sacred sites. Caesar mentions an annual gathering in the territory of the Carnutes in central Gaul, where Druids from across the Celtic world came together. They elected a chief Druid, exchanged knowledge, rendered judgments on intertribal disputes. This suggests a unity among Druids that transcended the political fragmentation of Celtic tribes, a shared identity that connected them despite belonging to often hostile communities. When Rome conquered Celtic territories, Druids resisted. They represented the old order, the old gods, the old independence. Romans systematically suppressed Druidism, particularly under the Emperor Claudius. They destroyed sacred groves, forbade Druidic gatherings, killed Druids they could capture. The last Druidic stand may have been on Anglesey in Wales, where Roman forces slaughtered Druids and destroyed their sacred sites in 60 AD. After that, Druids disappear from historical sources, their knowledge lost, their traditions broken, or perhaps not entirely lost. In Ireland, which Rome never conquered, Druids seem to have survived longer, eventually transforming into the Philid, the poet-scholars of medieval Irish society. Some Druidic knowledge may have passed into Christian monasticism, preserved by monks who wrote down the old stories, but Druids, as religious authorities, as priests of the Celtic gods, vanished. Their great libraries of memorized knowledge died with them, leaving us with fragments, hints, frustrating glimpses of a sophisticated intellectual tradition we can never fully recover. The sacred grove, deep in the forest, where human feet rarely tread, there is a place of silence. Ancient oaks grow here, their trunks thick as houses, their canopy so dense that even at midday the light is dim and green. These are the oldest trees, survivors of centuries, sacred beyond human memory. The ground is soft with accumulated leaves, layers upon layers compressed into a carpet that muffles every sound. Your footsteps are whispers. Even the birds seem to sing more quietly here, their voices reverent. Offerings hang from the lower branches, strips of cloth tied in careful knots. Bronze figurines suspended on cords, a sword, its blade deliberately broken, left for the gods. No one takes what has been given to this place. To steal from the gods is to invite destruction. At the centre of the grove stands the oldest oak, its trunk split and hollow, its bark furrowed like ancient skin. Ivy climbs its sides, green and vital despite the tree's great age. This tree was old when the settlement was founded. It will stand long after the current generation has passed into memory and myth. The air smells of earth and growth, of decay that feeds new life. Mushrooms sprout from fallen logs, ferns unfurl in the shadows. Water seeps from the ground in one corner, forming a small spring that never freezes, never runs dry. Moss grows thick around it, brilliant green, impossibly soft. You stand very still. The silence is not empty but full, pregnant with presence. You cannot see anything unusual, but you feel it, a watching, a weighing, an awareness that has nothing to do with human consciousness. The gods are here. The spirits are here. The grove is alive in ways that transcend the life of plants and soil. A breeze moves through the canopy, and the leaves rustle with a sound like distant conversation. The light shifts, patterns of brightness and shadow dancing across the forest floor. For a moment, you think you see a face in the bark of the great oak, eyes that look at you with ancient knowledge. Then the light changes, and it is only bark again, rough and dark. This is a threshold place, a boundary between the world of humans and the world of powers. To be here is to be neither fully in one realm nor the other. Time moves differently here, or perhaps it does not move at all. Perhaps this grove exists outside time, eternal, unchanging, a point of connection between earth and the infinite. You breathe slowly. You do not pray, not exactly, but your presence here is itself a kind of prayer. To witness, to acknowledge, to stand in this sacred space and remember that the world is larger and stranger than the human portion of it. Eventually, you turn and walk away, retracing your steps through the dim forest, moving back toward the human world of hill fort and hearth. But something of the grove stays with you, a sense of connection to the mysterious, a reminder that beneath the surface of daily life lies depth beyond measuring. Feasts and the bonds of community. The feast hall is warm with bodies and bright with firelight. Outside, winter wind howls, but inside is warmth and food and fellowship. The feast is the heart of Celtic community life, the place where social bonds are forged and maintained, where status is displayed and negotiated, where the stories that define identity are told. Hides are spread on the floor, in concentric circles around the central hearth. Seating position matters. The chief sits at the centre, surrounded by his closest warriors, his family, honoured guests. Further out sit clients and lesser warriors, farmers who have earned a place at the feast through service or valour. Every person knows their position, accepts it, or chafes against it depending on their ambition. Food arrives in abundance. Whole pigs roasted on spits, their skin crisp and dripping fat. Sides of beef, boiled in great bronze cauldrons. Bread, fresh and warm. Cheeses, hard and sharp. Butter, in wooden bowls. The scent is overwhelming, rich and savoury, making mouths water and stomachs growl. But before eating, there is ritual. The Druids bless the food, invoke the gods, pour libations. The chief speaks, honouring the occasion, remembering the dead, praising the living. Warriors who performed notable deeds are called forward, given gifts, acknowledged before the community. A young man who killed his first boar in the hunt receives a bronze pin. A warrior who distinguished himself in a recent cattle raid gets a gold arm ring. These moments are important. Public recognition that validates achievement, that transforms individual action into collective memory. Then comes the moment everyone anticipates and dreads. The hero's portion, the best cut of meat, usually the haunch of the roasted pig, is set aside. By tradition, it goes to the bravest warrior present. But who is bravest? The question is open to debate, and debates can turn violent. A warrior stands, announces his claim. He recounts his deeds. Enemies killed, cattle taken, dangerous journeys undertaken. He boasts, exaggerates perhaps, but within understood limits. The words must be eloquent, the claims must ring true. His peers listen, judge, accept or challenge. Another warrior stands. He disputes the first claim, advances his own. He too recounts deeds, perhaps mocks the first man's claims as inflated. The tension rises. Hands drift toward knives. The chief watches carefully. Sometimes he intervenes, awards the portion by fiat. Sometimes he lets it play out, allows the warriors to settle it themselves. Occasionally, men duel over the hero's portion, not to the death usually, but violently enough. The winner takes the meat and the honour. Once the hero's portion is awarded, general feasting begins. People eat with their hands, tearing meat from bones, wiping grease on bread, washing everything down with ale or mead or imported wine. If the chief is wealthy enough, eating is enthusiastic, unrestrained. Laughter rises. Conversations grow loud. This is abundance, proof that the community thrives, that the land provides, that the chief is generous. As the evening progresses, the bards begin. These are different from druids, though sometimes trained by them. Bards are poets, storytellers, musicians. They carry the history of the people in their songs. Tonight, they will sing of ancient heroes, of cattle raids and battles, of love and betrayal and vengeance. The words are beautiful, carefully crafted, memorized perfectly. A good bard can recite for hours without hesitation, can adjust his performance to the mood of the audience, can emphasize themes that resonate with current events. People listen raptly. These stories are not entertainment, not merely. They are education, moral instruction, connection to the past. Young people learn what behavior earns praise, what actions bring shame. They learn genealogies, understand who is related to whom, how feuds began, why certain families hold certain lands. They learn to value eloquence, to appreciate well-crafted phrases, to remember, as night deepens, the atmosphere becomes more relaxed. People move about, conversing with friends, negotiating deals, arranging marriages. The chief holds private conversations with important men, discusses politics and strategy, makes decisions that will affect the entire community. Clients approach their patrons, make requests, offer service. The feast is a marketplace of social capital, a place where relationships are maintained and transformed. Disputes arise, as they always do when men drink and pride is involved. Most are settled through words, through the intervention of elders or druids, through compromises reached in the pleasant haze of alcohol and full stomachs. Occasionally, men step outside to settle matters with fists or weapons. The chief maintains order, prevents things from escalating too far, ensures that feuds do not begin over drunken insults. Late in the night, couples slip away into the darkness. Children have long since fallen asleep, curled against their mothers or piled together in corners. The fire burns lower. The songs become slower, quieter, more melancholic. Eventually, people drift to sleep where they sit, wrapped in cloaks, trusting in the community's collective security. The feast is over, but its effects will last. Alliances have been strengthened. Status has been publicly acknowledged or adjusted. Stories have been told that will be remembered and retold. The community has come together, has celebrated its existence, has reminded itself that they are a people connected by blood, an oath, and shared stories. In a few days or weeks, there will be another feast, and the cycle will continue, binding the community together through shared ritual and abundance, binding through the timeless patterns of eating and drinking and storytelling that make humans something more than isolated individuals. Celtic mythology, gods of many names. To speak of Celtic religion is to enter a forest of uncertainty. We have no Celtic Bible, no sacred texts written by Celtic priests explaining their beliefs systematically. We have archaeological evidence, temples, votive offerings, inscriptions. We have accounts by Greek and Roman observers, usually brief and filtered through their own religious assumptions. We have medieval Irish and Welsh literature written down centuries after Christianization, preserving myths but in transformed, Christianized forms. From these fragmentary sources, we must reconstruct a religious world. The Celts worshipped many gods. Hundreds of names appear in inscriptions, votive offerings, place names. Some gods were worshipped widely, across the Celtic world. Others were purely local, known only in a single valley or river system. Celtic religion was not unified, not organized around a central orthodoxy. It was fluid, diverse, adapted to local conditions and needs. Romans encountering Celtic gods often identified them with Roman deities through interpretatio Romana, the practice of matching foreign gods with Roman equivalents. When they found a Celtic god associated with war, they called him Mars. A Celtic god connected with commerce became Mercury. This has created enormous confusion. Did the Celts worship Mars? Or did they worship a Celtic war god, whom Romans chose to call Mars? Were these gods truly equivalent, or merely similar in limited ways? One widespread Celtic god was Lugus, associated with light, skill, and kingship. His name survives in many place names. Lugdunum became Lyon in France, Leiden in the Netherlands, Lugavalium became Carlisle in England. He was honoured in the Feast of Lughnasadh, celebrated in early August, marking the beginning of harvest season. Irish mythology preserves him as Lugh, a multi-talented god skilled in all arts, the ideal of Celtic excellence. Another prominent god was Taranis, the Thunderer. His name relates to thunder, and Romans often equated him with Jupiter. Votive wheels found at Celtic sites may represent his symbol, perhaps connecting thunder with the rolling wheels of celestial chariots. He was a sky god, powerful and dangerous, requiring propitiation. Cernunnos appears in art and inscriptions, a horned god associated with nature, animals, fertility, and the underworld. The most famous image is on the Gundestrup cauldron, where he sits cross-legged, wearing antlers, surrounded by animals, holding a torque and a serpent. He represents the wild, the undomesticated powers of nature, the lord of animals and the hunt. Celtic goddesses were numerous and powerful. Brigid in Ireland was associated with poetry, healing, and smithcraft, three arts that the Celts considered related, all involving transformation and creation. She survived Christianization by becoming Street Brigid, her feast day preserved even as her nature changed. Epona was a goddess of horses, cavalry, and fertility, one of the few Celtic deities adopted into Roman religion, worshipped throughout the empire by cavalry units. Rivers were sacred, seen as goddesses themselves. The river Seine derives from Sequana, a Celtic goddess worshipped at its source. The river Boyne in Ireland was Boann. The Danube was Danu. Water was a liminal substance, connecting the upper world with the underworld, and offerings were cast into rivers and lakes to reach the gods. Thousands of weapons, torques, cauldrons, and other valuable objects have been recovered from Celtic rivers and bogs, placed there deliberately as votive offerings. Celtic cosmology seems to have involved multiple realms. There was the human world, the world of the gods above, and the world below, often associated with the dead but not necessarily a place of punishment. Death was not an ending, but a transition. Souls might move between realms, might be reborn, might feast with the gods in another world where there was no sickness or aging. Sacred sites were numerous. Springs and wells where water emerged from the earth, groves of ancient trees, particularly oaks, hilltops where earth met sky, islands in lakes. Celtic religion emphasized natural features rather than constructed temples, at least in the early period. The divine was immanent in the landscape, required no building to house it. Later, under Roman influence, Celts began constructing temples, but these were different from classical temples. Often they were small, square, or circular structures called Romano-Celtic temples. The inner room, the cella, was tiny, barely large enough for a cult statue or altar. Most worship happened outside, in the open air, maintaining older Celtic preferences for outdoor ritual. Sacrifices were central to Celtic religion. Animals, especially cattle and pigs, were killed and offered to gods. The meat was often shared in communal feasts, creating a bond between worshippers, gods, and community. Human sacrifice occurred, though how commonly remains debated. The evidence is real but difficult to interpret. Were humans sacrificed regularly, only in times of crisis, as punishment for crimes? Sources, conflict, and archaeology can confirm killing, but rarely reveals motivation. Celtic religion had no sharp boundary between sacred and profane. Everything was potentially sacred. A treaty was not merely a political agreement, but an oath sworn before gods. Breaking it invited divine punishment. Kingship was religious, the king serving as intermediary between his people and the gods, his health and fertility linked to the land's prosperity. Agriculture followed sacred calendars, planting and harvest marked by festivals and rituals. The four great Celtic festivals divided the year. Samhain, in early November, marked the end of the harvest season and the beginning of winter, a time when boundaries between worlds grew thin. Imbolc, in early February, celebrated the first stirrings of spring. Beltane, in early May, marked the beginning of summer, celebrated with bonfires and fertility rites. Lugnasad, in early August, honoured Lugus and began the harvest. These festivals survived Christianization, transformed but recognisable in later folk customs. Celtic mythology, as preserved in medieval Irish and Welsh literature, presents a complex world of heroes and gods, magic, and adventure. The Tuatha De Danann, the people of the goddess Danu, were supernatural beings who ruled Ireland before the arrival of humans. The Ulster cycle tells of Cuchulainn, the greatest warrior of Irish myth, who could transform into a battle frenzy so fierce he became unrecognisable. The Welsh Mabinogion preserves tales of Pwyll and Rhiannon, of magical cauldrons and shapeshifters. How accurately these medieval texts preserve pre-Christian beliefs is uncertain. They were written by Christian monks, who modified stories to make them less offensive to Christian sensibilities. Yet echoes of ancient beliefs persist. Gods who dwelt in Sid mounds beneath the earth, heroes who journeyed to other worlds, transformations and magic that suggest older worldviews. We see through a glass darkly, glimpsing shapes we cannot quite bring into focus, hearing voices we cannot quite understand, trying to reconstruct a religious world from its scattered fragments. The Lindo Man. On a summer day in 1984, workers at a peat-cutting operation in Cheshire, England, found something unexpected in the bog. A human body, preserved by the acidic, oxygen-free environment of the peat. The discovery would become one of the most important windows into Celtic ritual practice. The body was male, between 20 and 30 years old. At death, the peat had preserved him remarkably well, though it had stained his skin dark brown and his hair a reddish colour. His fingernails were clean and well manicured. His beard and moustache had been trimmed shortly before death. He had eaten a last meal of charred bread, made from various grains and seeds. He wore nothing but a fox fur armband, but it was how he died that made Lindo Man significant for understanding Celtic religion. He had been killed deliberately, ritually, in a way that suggested sacrifice rather than execution or murder. The archaeologists and forensic experts who examined him discovered what they called the threefold death. First, he had been struck twice on the head with a blunt object, hard enough to crack his skull. Then a cord had been placed around his neck and tightened, breaking his neck and strangling him. Finally, his throat had been cut. Any one of these would have been fatal. Together, they suggested intentional overkill, death administered 3 different ways, perhaps to satisfy 3 different gods, or to ensure the sacrifice was effective. His body had then been placed face down in the bog, a pool of standing water, and held there with stakes. The peat had done its work over the next 2,000 years, preserving him while his contemporaries crumbled to dust. Why was he killed? The evidence suggests he was special, possibly high status. His hands showed no signs of hard labour. His fingernails were carefully maintained. His body was healthy, well-nourished. This was not a criminal or a slave executed casually. This was someone important offered to the gods. The timing might be significant. Analysis of pollen in his gut suggested his last meal included mistletoe, a plant sacred to Druids, according to ancient sources. His death occurred sometime in the 1st century AD, a period when Roman pressure on Celtic Britain was intensifying. Perhaps he was sacrificed in response to crisis, an offering to persuade the gods to protect the people from the invaders. Or perhaps he volunteered. Some scholars have suggested that Celtic religion allowed for self-sacrifice, for individuals to offer themselves to the gods in times of desperate need. The threefold death might have been necessary for the sacrifice to reach all realms of existence: the upper world, the middle world, and the underworld. He might have gone to his death willingly, believing his sacrifice would save his people. We will never know his name. We cannot know if he was priest or king, or simply a man who drew the short straw in some ritual selection. But his preservation gives us something precious: physical evidence of practices that ancient writers described, but that we might otherwise doubt. Human sacrifice was real. The threefold death was not Roman propaganda, but actual practice. The Celts did kill in service to their gods, did believe that human blood had power to intercede with divine forces. Lindoman lies now in the British Museum, still curled in the position in which he died, still bearing the marks of the violence that ended his life. Visitors look into his face and see something human and relatable. A young man from 2,000 years ago, who died in service to beliefs we struggle to understand. His death was meant to have meaning, to accomplish something, to change the world. Whether it succeeded, whether the gods he died to propitiate heard his sacrifice and responded, we cannot know. But he died believing it mattered, and perhaps that belief is itself significant. Rome's northern shadow. For centuries, Rome and the Celtic world existed in uneasy proximity. Rome controlled Italy, gradually expanding its influence. Celtic tribes dominated Gaul, the vast territory that encompassed modern France and Belgium. Between them lay the Alps, a formidable natural barrier, but not an impassable one. Trade flowed between the two worlds. Knowledge of each other grew, and gradually, inevitably, their interests began to conflict. The early centuries of contact were marked by mutual caution and occasional violence. Rome remembered the sack of the city in 390 BC, nursed a deep fear of Gallic invasions. They built walls, maintained armies on their northern frontier, negotiated carefully with Celtic tribes. The Celts, for their part, saw Rome as another power among many, potentially useful as trading partners or dangerous as enemies, but not yet an existential threat. By the 2nd century BC, Rome had conquered Cisalpine Gaul, the Celtic territories in northern Italy. The process was slow and violent, resisted fiercely by Celtic tribes who saw their lands and independence threatened. But Rome was patient and relentless. They built roads, established colonies of Roman citizens, gradually assimilated or expelled the Celtic populations. The Po Valley, once thoroughly Celtic, became Roman. This conquest brought Rome directly to the Alps, to the edge of Gaul proper. Roman merchants began travelling through Gallic territories, establishing trading relationships, learning about Celtic political divisions and rivalries. Roman generals eyed the rich lands to the north, the fertile fields, the mineral wealth, the potential for glory and plunder. The stage was being set for confrontation. Southern Gaul came under Roman influence first. The Greek colony of Massalia, modern Marseille, had long been a Roman ally. When local Celtic tribes threatened Massalia, Rome intervened, claiming to defend its ally. In 121 BC, Roman armies crushed the Arverni tribe and their allies. Rome established a province in southern Gaul, Gallia Narbonensis, creating a land corridor connecting Italy to Roman territories in Spain. The province brought benefits. Roman roads made travel easier. Roman markets provided outlets for Gallic goods. Peace under Roman rule meant less warfare between tribes. Some Gallic chieftains recognized the advantages of cooperation with Rome, became allies, adopted Roman customs, but it also meant Roman governors extracting taxes, Roman laws superseding Celtic customs, Roman cultural influence gradually eroding Celtic identity. Northern Gaul remained independent, but Rome's shadow was growing. Celtic tribes were aware of Roman power, had seen what happened to those who resisted. Some tribes sought Roman alliance, hoping to use Roman support against their Celtic enemies. Others viewed Rome with suspicion, saw the province as the first step in eventual conquest. Still others ignored Rome, focused on traditional concerns like feuds with neighbouring tribes, cattle raids, internal politics. The fundamental problem was Celtic disunity. Gaul was not a nation but a patchwork of tribes, each autonomous, each pursuing its own interests. They could not unite against external threats, because they could not agree on who should lead, could not trust each other, could not put aside generations of feuds and rivalries. This was the weakness Rome would exploit. By the mid-1st century BC, Gaul was ripe for conquest. The tribes were wealthy, producing agricultural surplus, iron tools and weapons, beautiful metalwork that Roman markets desired. But they were divided, sometimes at war with each other, lacking any central authority that could coordinate resistance. And Rome had a new proconsul appointed to govern southern Gaul, a man with vast ambition, enormous debts, and the military genius to satisfy his hunger for glory. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar, and he was looking north, rivers, and rain. The rain begins as mist, barely perceptible, a dampness in the air that slowly thickens. Then individual drops, soft impacts on leaves, on water, on skin, then a steady fall, vertical and gentle, transforming the world into grey curtains of water falling from grey sky. The river accepts the rain, its surface dimpled with countless impacts, circles spreading and overlapping, a constant motion that never resolves into pattern. The water rises, imperceptibly at first, then noticeably, climbing the muddy banks, swallowing stones that marked the edge, reaching for the roots of willows. Water flows from high places to low. Water follows the land's contours, carves channels through earth, carries soil downstream grain by grain. The river has flowed here for thousands of years, will flow for thousands more. It knows patience, knows persistence, knows that hard stone eventually yields to soft water given enough time. The sound of rain is everywhere. On thatch, a gentle drumming. On water, a continuous hiss. On stone, scattered taps. On leaves, a rustle and drip. Each leaf gathering drops until their weight becomes too much, and they fall, splashing to other leaves below, a cascade of surrendered water. Inside the roundhouse, smoke from the central fire finds its way up and out through the roof. The rain does not enter. The thatch sheds water, as it was designed to do, keeps the interior dry despite the downpour outside. People sit close to the fire, wrapped in wool, listening to the rain, waiting for it to pass, or resign themselves to its continuation. The river is sacred. It has a name that is also the name of a goddess. Offerings lie in its depths, swords and shields, and bronze cauldrons thrown from the banks in ceremonies that marked important moments. The river accepted these gifts, pulled them down into its mud, kept them in darkness and silence. The river remembers everything it has swallowed. Rain on the forest creates 1,000 different sounds. Each leaf makes its own music. Water gathers on oak leaves, pools in their curves, falls in heavy drops. Beech leaves channel rain toward their stems, creating streams in miniature. Pine needles shed water immediately, each needle adding its small voice to the complex chorus. Water seeps into earth, soaks through layers of leaf litter and soil, filters down to bedrock, emerges elsewhere as springs. The same water that falls as rain reappears from the ground, cold and clear, in places that seem removed from rainfall. Water circulates, rises and falls, connects sky and earth, and the depths below in eternal cycle. The rain continues. It will stop eventually, but for now, it is the world's dominant feature, the sky's gift to the earth, the element that makes life possible. Without rain, fields produce nothing. Without rain, cattle die of thirst. Without rain, rivers dwindle to trickles. The Celts know this, depend on this, fear drought more than flood. Eventually, slowly, the rain diminishes. Drops become fewer, lighter. The clouds thin. A brightness suggests the sun exists somewhere above the grey. The sound of water falling changes tone, becomes intermittent, then stops. Leaves drip for a while longer, releasing stored water. Then even that ceases. The world is wet, but no longer falling. The cycle pauses, gathers itself, prepares to begin again. Caesar's ambition. The Gallic Wars begin. Julius Caesar arrived in Gaul in 58 BC as governor of both Cisalpine Gaul and the new province of Gallia Narbonensis. He was 41 years old, heavily in debt from political campaigns in Rome, ambitious beyond measure, and determined to win military glory that would make his name immortal. Gaul offered opportunity, wealthy tribes, political divisions he could exploit, and most importantly, a pretext for war. The pretext came quickly. The Helvetii, a Celtic tribe inhabiting what is now Switzerland, decided to migrate. Their territory was under pressure from Germanic tribes pressing from the east. They planned to relocate westward into Gaul proper, moving through or near the Roman province. The migration involved hundreds of thousands of people, entire families with their possessions, livestock, everything they owned. Caesar saw danger and opportunity. He claimed the migration threatened the province, that the Helvetii might attack Roman territory, that Germanic tribes following them posed even greater danger. He mobilized his legions and marched to intercept the migration. What followed was a series of battles in which Roman discipline and tactics proved superior to Celtic valor and numbers. Caesar slaughtered the Helvetii, killed tens of thousands, forced survivors to return to their homeland. But Caesar did not stop there. Having entered Gaul, having assembled his legions, having achieved a victory that justified his presence, he found new reasons to stay, new threats to combat. A Germanic king, Ariovistus, had crossed the Rhine with warriors and was establishing himself in Gaul, invited by some Celtic tribes as mercenaries, threatening others. Caesar determined to expel him, to protect Gallic tribes from Germanic domination. Another campaign, another victory. The Germanic warriors were driven back across the Rhine. The pattern was established. Caesar would identify a threat, real or exaggerated. He would respond with military force, defeating enemies with brutal efficiency. Then he would discover new threats, new reasons why his legions were needed in Gaul. Each campaign generated wealth in plunder and slaves. Each victory enhanced his reputation in Rome, made him more powerful, more dangerous to his political enemies, more indispensable to his supporters. The Gallic tribes were slow to recognize what was happening. Many viewed Caesar as an ally who had helped them against the Helvetii, or the Germans. Some tribes sought Roman protection against their traditional Celtic enemies, invited Caesar to intervene in their conflicts. They saw opportunities for advancement through cooperation with Rome, did not yet understand that Caesar's ultimate goal was the conquest of all Gaul. Caesar's military effectiveness was terrifying. Roman legions were professional soldiers, trained to fight as units, disciplined and obedient, equipped with standardized weapons and armor. They built fortifications with incredible speed, creating defended camps every night, even on the march. They used engineering to overcome obstacles, building bridges across rivers, siege works around fortified positions, roads to facilitate movement. Against Celtic warriors, brave and skilled individually, but lacking coordination and discipline, the legions were devastatingly effective. The campaigns of 57 BC extended Roman control over much of northern Gaul. Caesar marched against the Belgae, powerful tribes in what is now Belgium, defeating them in battles where Celtic numerical superiority meant nothing against Roman tactics. He sent his legates, subordinate commanders, to conquer tribes along the Atlantic coast, bringing them under Roman authority through threat of force or actual violence. Each conquered tribe was required to provide hostages, guarantees of good behavior. These hostages, usually the children of nobles, were kept in Roman custody, essentially prisoners, though treated with relative courtesy. They learned Latin, absorbed Roman culture, became tools for controlling their home tribes. Their parents dared not rebel, while their children were held by Rome. Caesar also used diplomacy, dividing Gaul by rewarding cooperative tribes and punishing resistant ones. He established relationships with individual chieftains, gave them gifts and honors, made them dependent on Roman support. He exploited existing feuds between tribes, supporting one side against another, weakening both in the process. The Aedui, one of the most powerful Gallic tribes, became Roman allies, received Caesar's patronage, used Roman support to dominate their neighbours. But not all Gauls were blind to Caesar's intentions. Some tribes resisted from the beginning, fought desperately against Roman conquest. The Veneti, a maritime people on the Atlantic coast, rebelled in 56 BC, retreating to fortified settlements accessible only by sea. Caesar built a fleet, defeated them in naval battle, crushed their rebellion with spectacular cruelty, executing their leaders, and selling the entire population into slavery. Such atrocities were meant as lessons, warnings to other tribes of the cost of resistance. Caesar was generous to those who submitted, ruthless to those who defied him. The message was clear: cooperate and prosper, resist and die. Many tribes chose cooperation, at least initially, not realizing that cooperation was merely a stage on the path to complete subjugation. By 55 BC, 5 years into his governorship, Caesar had conquered most of Gaul. He had crossed the Rhine into Germanic territory, a symbolic demonstration of Roman power. He had even crossed the narrow sea to Britain, conducting raids that accomplished little militarily, but enhanced his glory in Rome. The wealthy tribes of Gaul were becoming Roman subjects, paying taxes, providing troops, gradually being absorbed into the empire. But beneath the surface of submission, resentment was building. Gallic nobles saw their authority diminished, their people exploited, their ancient freedoms curtailed. They began to understand that Caesar intended permanent conquest, that Rome would never leave, that their world was being destroyed. And slowly, impossibly, they began to contemplate something that had never happened before in Celtic history, uniting, putting aside centuries of tribal rivalries, coming together against the common enemy. The stage was set for a final, desperate resistance. Vercingetorix, the last stand. In the winter of 53 to 52 BC, something extraordinary happened in Gaul. A young Arverni noble named Vercingetorix began travelling secretly between tribes, speaking to chieftains, arguing for unity against Rome. He was perhaps in his early 30s, charismatic and eloquent, possessed of a vision that was radical for Celtic culture, all Gallic tribes uniting under a single military command to expel the Romans. This should have been impossible. The tribes hated each other, fought each other constantly, valued independence above almost everything. No Gallic leader had ever united all the tribes. The idea went against everything Celtic political culture stood for. Yet Vercingetorix convinced them. Tribe after tribe agreed to join the rebellion, to subordinate their autonomy to a unified command, to fight not for tribal advantage, but for the freedom of all Gaul. The rebellion began in the winter, catching Caesar off guard. He was south of the Alps, away from his legions. Gallic tribes rose across the territory, attacked Roman garrisons, killed Roman merchants and settlers. They declared their independence, renounced their treaties with Rome. The scale of the revolt was unprecedented. Tribes that had been Roman allies for years joined the rebellion. Even the Aedui, Rome's most reliable Gallic supporters, eventually wavered and then broke their alliance. Caesar rushed back to Gaul with desperate speed, moving with small forces through hostile territory, taking enormous risks. He gathered his scattered legions, began planning his response. He expected this to be like previous rebellions, isolated and quickly crushed. He did not yet understand that Vercingetorix was different, that this time the Gauls were fighting intelligently, strategically, learning from their defeats. Vercingetorix implemented a scorched earth policy. Rather than defending every settlement, he ordered Gallic tribes to burn their own towns, to destroy their own crops, to deny the Roman supplies. Roman armies lived off the land they conquered. If the land offered nothing, if there was no food to requisition, no shelter to occupy, the legions would starve. It was a painful strategy, requiring tremendous sacrifice from the Gauls themselves, but it was effective. The Romans struggled. Their supplies dwindled. Their soldiers went hungry. Caesar besieged one of the few Gallic towns that Vercingetorix had not burned, Avaricum, hoping to replenish his stores. The siege took weeks, during which Vercingetorix harassed the Romans constantly, cutting off foraging parties, making every expedition outside the siege lines dangerous. When the Romans finally took Avaricum, they massacred its population in fury and frustration, killing 40,000 people, according to Caesar's own account. But Vercingetorix was learning, adapting. He understood now that Gallic warriors could not defeat Roman legions in pitched battle on open ground. Roman discipline and tactics were too effective. So he avoided such battles, used cavalry to harass Romans, retreated to fortified positions when pressed. He was fighting a war of attrition, trying to wear down the Romans, make the conquest too costly to maintain. The campaign culminated at Alesia, a fortified hilltop town where Vercingetorix retreated with his army after a failed assault on a Roman position. Caesar followed and besieged the town. But Alesia was formidable. Situated on a steep hill, naturally defended, garrisoned by tens of thousands of warriors. To besiege it, Caesar needed to build fortifications that would contain the defenders while protecting his own forces. What he built was astonishing. Even by Roman engineering standards, he constructed two sets of fortifications, one facing inward toward Alesia to contain the defenders, one facing outward to defend against relief forces he knew would come. The inner wall was 11 miles long, the outer wall 14 miles, both featuring ditches, sharpened stakes, traps, and towers at regular intervals. He created a double siege containing the Gauls inside Alesia while preparing to fight off rescue attempts from outside. Vercingetorix waited for relief, sent out horsemen to summon help before the Roman siege lines closed completely. The Gallic tribes responded with unprecedented unity. They gathered an enormous relief army, perhaps 250,000 warriors, and marched on Alesia. For a brief moment, the fate of Gaul hung in balance. If the relief army could break Caesar's outer fortifications, if they could coordinate with Vercingetorix's forces inside Alesia to attack the Romans from both sides, they might achieve victory. The battle was desperate and confused. The relief army attacked Caesar's outer fortifications repeatedly. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix's forces tried to break out, coordinating their assaults with attacks from outside. For days, the fighting raged. Roman lines bent, but held. Caesar moved personally to threatened points, rallied his troops, threw in his reserves at critical moments. Gradually, the Gallic attacks weakened. Casualties mounted. Coordination between inside and outside forces proved impossible. The relief army began to dissolve, tribes departing individually, abandoning the effort. Inside Alesia, supplies ran out. Starvation loomed. Vercingetorix faced an impossible situation. He could continue the siege until his army starved to death, or he could surrender. He chose surrender, but on his own terms. He rode out of Alesia alone, wearing his finest armour, mounted on his best horse. He rode to Caesar's camp, dismounted, laid down his weapons at Caesar's feet, and gave himself up. In doing so, he spared his army, and died. Caesar allowed the Gallic warriors to leave Alesia, to return to their tribes. He wanted them alive, needed them docile. Killing them all would create martyrs, make future governance difficult. But Vercingetorix himself could not be spared. He was too dangerous, too charismatic, too potent as a symbol of resistance. Caesar kept him prisoner for 6 years, dragged him through Rome during Caesar's triumph as a trophy of conquest, then had him strangled in prison in 46 BC. He was perhaps 40 years old at death, having spent the last years of his life in chains, exhibited as proof of Roman superiority. The rebellion died with Alesia. Other revolts would occur, but never again with such unity, never again with such hope of success. Gaul was conquered. The ancient freedom of Celtic tribes was ended. Roman governors would rule, Roman law would prevail, Roman culture would gradually supplant Celtic traditions. Within a few generations, Gaul would be Roman, the Celtic language, giving way to Latin, Celtic gods, renamed and reimagined through Roman interpretations. Celtic independence becoming a memory. Vercingetorix failed, but his failure was heroic. He had achieved what no Celtic leader before him had managed, uniting the tribes in common purpose. For one brief moment, the Celts fought not as isolated tribes but as a people, defending their way of life against an existential threat. That they failed says less about Vercingetorix's leadership than about the overwhelming power of Rome, the discipline of its legions, the ruthlessness of its commanders. The Celts discovered, as many others would, that valour and courage could not overcome organisation and persistence. Caesar's conquest of Gaul was complete. He had won glory that made him the most famous Roman of his generation. He had acquired wealth that financed his subsequent civil war. He had created legions loyal to him personally rather than to the Roman state. And he had destroyed Celtic Gaul, ending centuries of independence, absorbing its territories into an empire that would last for 500 years. The Celtic way of life in continental Europe was over. Only on the islands and edges of the Celtic world would it survive, transformed and diminished, but not yet extinguished.